Good morning, Music 395 students, Form and Analysis students. I'm sitting here with an object, a set of objects actually, that are all connected to each other. Your powers of memory and deduction have already figured out what it is. If I were to show you this same location on this satellite view, it would look completely differently. And as you know, with Google satellite views, you could pull out further and further, and it would be less and less recognizable. It's an aerial view, it's a completely different perspective, and we are moving in these satellite views away from what I'll call human scale. It's not my own term, it's a term that's used a fair amount in philosophical and physical literature. This set here, this play set, would be experienced normally on human scale. You would have children probably relating to these objects in their own dimensions. But if you pull away from this, upward or out laterally, it becomes something not in human scale. That is to say, we see it as you're looking down from an airliner and you see people, or you see houses, and they gradually recede and they become sort of like little cells, or people become ants. It's that sort of thing. So I mention this in part because it relates to our topic, and also because it relates to the times in which you're living. This quarantine or isolation or exile period, this shelter-in-place period, when we look back in our lives, assuming we survive, it'll be just this small portion of our lives. In the scale of human history, of course, it just will be a hair's breadth. But for us now, in human scale, it's gigantic, it's overwhelming, it's looming. And we're having to deal with it day by day, minute by minute, and so forth. Well, what does this have to do with our lesson? We have been looking at musical devices, techniques, components in a very small scale, talking about motives, and a little bit larger scale, talking about phrases, and we talk about sections of pieces, and then we talk about the shape of whole pieces themselves. And now we're sort of going to another level of scale and looking at the combination of pieces that are basically self-contained, and we're calling them movements. They're just sections of some larger piece, in the way that we talk about a symphony as being a thing. A symphony, it's an organism in itself, or it's an object in itself, but it has these movements that are really complete pieces within it. Now, I put on your course outline the rubric for this section of the course: archives as organisms. I hope, scratch your head a little bit about that. I stole the phraseology there a little bit from Lewis Thomas's book, The Lives of a Cell. It's 1974, I think it was written. The subtitle being Notes of a Biology Watcher. And Lewis Thomas wrote columns for a few years, I think for the New England Journal of Medicine. In any case, one of those was called On Societies as Organisms. Another one was called Organelles as Organisms. And they're dealing with looking at things in different scales. So when you, for example, when talking about societies as organisms, well, you look at an anthill, and if you get real close, you see individual ants moving around and doing this or that, lifting something, marching in file, whatever. But the further you get away from it and contemplate it, you realize, oh, this really is operating as one organism, one system in itself. It's not all these individual things, or at least not merely that. It's actually, as though it were moving by one mind or one act of will, everything moving towards the same ideal. You know, we have this symbol in our area here in Mormondom itself, I can call it that, of the beehive. And it's the same thing, the idea being we're all working together for the same end. That's the beehive concept, if we can call it that. So, archives as organisms is my way of saying you have collections of documents, scores in this case, that in themselves, by a different viewpoint, different perspective, are larger organisms. So we can talk about sonata form as consisting in one movement, and that's a complete piece. But we also talk about sonatas, piano sonatas, for example, and those are multi-movement pieces, but we still say they are one thing. All of those things go together in some way. So we're talking about pieces that are, well, pieces itself, of course, suggests they're part of a larger whole. These things that are joined together to become something larger that we assume, because the composer did it this way, represents itself a larger motion of thought, if I can put it that way. So let's get down to the nuts and bolts of it. I want to just have you look at pieces that consist of two pieces. Actually, let me put it this way. Look at sets that consist of two pieces, and then three pieces, and four pieces, and then more than four pieces. If you look at this play set here, you can see lots of things in it. You've got swings over there. You've got this tire swing. You've got a slide. You've got a ladder. You've got these sort of, I don't know, these wall climbing things on the side here. These, I don't even know what you call this kind of a swing with the hand grips on it and so on. But each of those things you could look at individually, and they're all self-contained, but they've been joined together here in a set. And so I liken this to some of the things that we'll be looking at today. And so I'm just going to run through these with you. I like to bundle things together, you know, in pairs. Twos and threes is how we think in music and how we think generally. That's the way our minds are wired, to reduce things to twos and threes as much as we can. So let's start with two-piece sets. You've got vocal and instrumental. In the vocal realm, the main two-piece sets would be recitative and aria. This is in operas and oratorios. I would recommend that you go back and listen to some segments of Messiah, since that's a very familiar work, and I'll send you links maybe to a few, but I think you can do this on your own. This is where you have the same singer singing the recitative, which is moving through sort of describing a situation, something, and so usually syllabic. It's moving through a lot of text fairly quickly. And then you have the aria, which is more tuneful. We might have repetitions of phrases, textual phrases that is, and maybe more melismatic passages. That's one type of vocal two-set pair. Another type is really related to that. It's in popular music a lot. It's the verse-refrain structure. Now, this is not where you have a verse and then everybody sings together on the chorus, but this is what you have in a lot of popular songs. You remember the beginning of this chorus, I sang for you A Foggy Day, the Gershwin tune, A Foggy Day in London Town, etc. So, and that's the song that everyone knows, but there's actually a verse that goes before that that's kind of like a recitative in the operatic tradition, and then you get to the aria, which is the song that we know as A Foggy Day. There are other examples. I'll send you maybe a link to Frank Sinatra songs where we know the aria, we'll call it that way, the main thing, but you probably haven't heard the verse part, so-called, that precedes that, which is akin to the recitative before an aria in operatic and oratorio tradition. Remember we did the song Jim. We played through that Jim, da 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 dum bum bum, ba da da ba ba da da ba bum ba da, etc. Well, that's actually the refrain of the song. There's a verse that goes before that. You only sing that verse one time as a prelude, in effect, to what we know as the song. I was thinking last night of Tony Bennett's great song. I guess it's because I'm thinking of New York and all the sort of horrifying sickness that is taking place there, and quite a bit in California too, in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, where I'm from. Well, his song, classic song, I Left My Heart in San Francisco, starts this way. This is the verse, and then he goes into the refrain, which is what we think of as the song. So he sings, "The loveliness of Paris seems somehow sadly gay. The glory that was Rome is of another day. I've been terribly alone and forgotten in Manhattan. I'm going home to my city by the bay. I left my heart in San Francisco, high on a hill. It calls to me." Well, you can hear there the move from the verse to the refrain, or in the operatic tradition, it would be the recitative going into the aria. It's the same tradition, it's just different eras and different genres, you might say. Now, in the instrumental realm, we have some very common two set pairs as well. Really three of them I'll mention to you. One is the preludes and fugues. These you know best from Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier, 2 books, 24 preludes and fugues apiece. These kinds of pairs exist in other works as well, but this is sort of the monolithic, monument of musical history. You've got a prelude in a particular key followed by a fugue in that key. And sometimes these are toccatas and fugues. Again, Bach, the da-da-da, da-da-da, bum, ba-da-dum, ba-da-ba-bum. The toccata and fugue in D minor. I'm not doing it right, but you know what I'm talking about. That toccata and fugue in D minor. It's a pair. They're self-contained pieces, but they're joined together to be a larger work, a 2-piece set that's instrumental. The second kind is the French overture, very much a part of what's late 17th century, early 18th century opera tradition, and in other works. Again, the opening of Messiah that's a French overture. You've got this slow, stately, long, short rhythm pattern, ding, da-dum, 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 that sort of thing. And then that's followed by a faster and usually fugal or fugue-ish contrapuntal piece that's much faster. Anyway, so that's a French overture. It's these 2 parts, the slow and the fast, but they're joined together as one thing. Kind of like this, you have in the sonata and symphony and string quartet tradition that emerges mostly in the mid-18th century, moves into the 19th, this notion of the initial movement, the, 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 the founding movement of the set, having two parts to it, the slow introduction and then the faster main movement. We saw this in the Haydn 104th, isn't that the number? It's dum, dum, da-dum, dum, dum, da-dum. And you analyze that. We looked at that section, that introductory section. That's a whole piece. But it's not called a whole piece, it's not numbered or labeled as a whole piece in the scheme of the larger symphony itself. Those two are joined together, so that's a two-piece set. So we've got those, reviewing that, we've got the two vocal types, which would be the recitative and aria, or the verse-refrain in popular song literature, particularly of the United States. And then you have the instrumental types, which would be the prelude and fugue, the French overture, and the introduction and allegro opening to a sonata movement, a symphony, or could be string quartet. Okay, so now let's talk about three-piece sets. They're just, I think of these as instrumental. I don't know why no vocal ones came to mind, so I'm just going to let you learn these three instrumental types of three-piece sets. So you have the Italian overture, that's associated with Italian operas, and well, I guess that makes sense, right? Because it's called an Italian overture. But they're usually traced to Alessandro Scarlatti, Domenico's dad, I think. You know Domenico Scarlatti for all these keyboard pieces that every piano player has to learn, it seems like. And here it's a fast, slow, fast set of three. That's pretty much it. You could get into that more, but it is a precursor to things that come later. For example, many solo sonatas of that era, and especially in the 20th century, in my perception at least, just three movement sets like that, and they're almost always fast, slow, fast. It comes out of that Italian overture tradition, okay? The last of the three instrumental types of three-piece sets would be most concertos. It's a fast, slow, fast situation as well. So you have the soloist who is playing. When I say concertos, by the way, I'm referring to post-concerto grosso concertos. That is where you have an individual who is virtuoso on, piano or violin or flute, whatever it might be. And they are showing off in the piece, and those multi-movement sets or three-piece sets that we call concerti are usually fast, slow, fast. The first movement, by the way, might be in itself a little two-piece set, as we talked about, the slow and the fast, the slow introduction and the faster allegro. Now, when you get into four-piece sets, I think of there being really two of these, both instrumental. The first I'll mention is the sonata type. That is to say, if you think of a piano sonata, which many of you are familiar with and have played complete piano sonatas, or string quartets, or symphonies, they tend to be four-piece sets. Often, certainly in the classical era, you would have the allegro movement sometimes called in form a sonata allegro, because the quote-unquote form of that piece, you know how weird I am about using the term form as such. The formation we call sonata, the idea of the sonata, that's the first movement. Tends to be a fast movement. That's the sonata allegro notion. Allegro meaning joyful, but fast is implicit in that. Then you have a slow second movement. Then the third movement would be a minuet, or later with Beethoven, a scherzo, so a faster triple meter thing, but a sort of a dance piece in a way. And then the fourth movement, a finale, again being fast. So first movement fast, second movement slow, third movement minuet or scherzo, and the fourth movement varies in its form, sometimes sonata, sometimes rondo, and so on. Now, these are, I'm painting with a real broad brush here, but it's fairly standard. I mean, I'm not being non-legit in what I'm saying in these characterizations. But there are many variations, of course, over time. These things deviate and evolve, mutate, and composers say, well, I'm going to do mine this way this time, and so forth. So that's sort of the huge foundational, in some ways, four-piece set that you have in the late 18th century through the 19th century and beyond, as far as that goes. Although in the 20th century, these kinds of pieces tended to move a little more towards three-piece sets. That is to say, usually dropping that minuet or that third movement thing that you had in the earlier eras. The other four-piece set is a little dicey in that it doesn't really exist in a four-piece alone set. What I'm talking about here is the Baroque dance suite. You have, it seems to me, and you can check this out in the Bach French suites and English suites, there are many, countless other pieces of this era. It's called a suite. It's a dance suite. It has certain dances in it, but the four necessary ones are the Allemand, Courant, Sarabande, and the Gigue. Those four, in that order, by the way, are present everywhere. But I don't know of any dance suites that are just those four. There are other things that are attached to them or inserted between them. They're always there as signposts along the way, in my experience, but you'll often have a prelude or an introduction movement of some type before you do the Allemand. And you might have in the midst a minuet, or more than one minuet, or a gavotte, or a bourrée, or you know what I'm saying. But those four movements are sort of, again, they're the four corners, in a way, of a Baroque dance suite. So they're necessary, but probably not sufficient to have a Baroque dance suite. And this takes us to this last category that I'm going to mention here. This would be 4+ sets, kind of like this playground, this play set behind me. The kids could just call it a playground, which is interesting in itself. You have here, and by the way, the Baroque dance suite is kind of a 4+, because the four are generally not enough for that. It's just that these four are always present, it seems. But I'm thinking here of suites. S-U-I-T-E-S. You might be thinking of other kinds of suites, and I'll be thinking of those in a little while, I'm sure. But here, instrumentally, you just have a series of movements put together, four or more, usually more. They might be unified beyond instrumentation, by a concept, the Mother Goose Suite or something like that. But a folk song suite, you see those in band literature, for example, Vaughan Williams and whatnot. You also have ballet suites, and I'd like you to look up some of those, just ponder those and maybe look online, ballet suites. What would those be? The main composers, to my mind here, would be Tchaikovsky, Copland, and Stravinsky, where they wrote a full ballet, but they then put some of the segments of that ballet into a concert piece. Don't need the dancers. This can be played, these movements joined together into a suite as a concert piece for orchestra. You also have suites from the soundtracks of films. The Copland Our Town suite is a great example of that beautiful set. It's just taken from the soundtrack that he wrote to the, I think, 1940 film of Thornton Wilder's play, Our Town. You also have kind of vocal suites. Now, they're not called suite, but there's two types of vocal more than 4-piece sets. Vocal more than 4-piece sets. Song cycles, one of them. So often multiple songs with a single poet as the lyricist. They're all joined together in a set, and they'll often tell a story. They'll move from one thing to another. The Dichterliebe of Schumann, for example. Perfect example, the sort of glow of initial love, and then the breakup, and then gloom and despair, and so on. You might also have song cycles that bring together different poets, same composer, but different authors of texts, to surround and give different perspectives on a theme. That is to say, not a musical theme, but some literary or social theme. So the other vocal type would be medleys, where the performers will just join together a number of songs. This kind of thing happened a lot in rock music of the Bay Area, going back to my city by the Bay, in the late 1960s, where they'd play a whole bunch of songs together. Grateful Dead was one of those groups that would do that. And even the larger segment of the B-side of the Beatles album Abbey Road, they referred to it when they were putting it together as the big medley. They understood that concept. It's like a suite of all these pieces, but it is as a medley is, I'll put it this way, an attacca suite. Attacca being the term for the ending of one movement has no pause before the next movement begins, or the ending of one piece has no pause before the next piece begins. That's the attacca concept. Well, I hear some lawnmowers heading my way, and so I'm going to need to vacate the space in just a minute. But I'll just mention one other very special, to my mind, as an album collector, a kind of 4+ piece set. And that's the album. Nowadays, album is maybe it's a more fluid concept. We'll get into that next time. I will have you visit my own album collection. But the idea here being that a group has created their set of pieces and recorded them and put them together in one fixed object. Now you in your generation tend to take those things and disassemble them and create your own albums. your own playlists, or in an earlier era, the mixtape, that sort of thing. We'll talk about that next time, or maybe I'll just email you some information on that. I hope you're having a great, as you can, day and season of life right now. I miss being with you, but I am glad we can communicate a little bit in this method. Bye.